3 months ago, I stumbled across a video that someone had shared in a support group for people who'd lost everything. The title was simple: When God Calls Your Name. I almost scrolled past it, but something made me stop. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying secrets for so long, or maybe it was the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might understand what it means to hear your real name for the first time when you're 26 years old. I watched that video 7 times before I found the courage to write this message. Right now, I'm sitting in a small church on the island of Cyprus, holding an official government letter that confirms what I already knew. I am stateless, nameless in the eyes of every nation on earth. The paper is damp from the rain that's been falling for 3 days straight, drumming against the colored glass windows like fingers tapping out Morse code. Above me, a simple wooden cross hangs on the whitewashed wall, and I find myself wondering if the man who died on wood like that ever imagined his followers would one day hide in places like this, whispering new names to themselves in empty sanctuaries. My legal name was scratched out with black ink by men who once called me son, brother, heir. But the name I whisper now, the one that makes my chest warm, even in this cold church, was given to me by someone who saw me drowning in silk and gold and threw me a rope made of grace. This is the story of how a prince discovered he was never meant to wear a crown, but to carry a cross. It's the story of how I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. The palace where I grew up had 47 rooms, but I can still remember the exact temperature of every marble floor, always cold, even when the desert sun turned the air outside into liquid fire. In Bahrain, our family name was whispered with the same reverence people reserve for kings and prophets. My father held the position of Minister of Interior, which meant our bloodline was woven into the very fabric of the nation's identity. I was groomed from birth to be perfect, the ideal Muslim son, the future politician, the living embodiment of everything our culture valued. Before I could properly hold a pencil, I was holding prayer beads. Before I learned to ride a bicycle, I learned to recite Quranic verses with perfect pronunciation. My childhood tutors weren't hired to help me discover my interests. They were there to eliminate any interests that didn't align with my predetermined destiny. I remember sitting in the grand library, surrounded by leather-bound books in Arabic, English, and French, while my instructor drilled me on the proper way to greet foreign dignitaries, the correct posture for state photographs, the precise tone of voice that conveyed authority without arrogance. The palace walls were covered with portraits of my ancestors, caliphs, ministers, men who had shaped the political landscape of the Gulf for generations. Their painted eyes followed me through the corridors, and I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on my small shoulders like stones. I learned early that my life wasn't my own. Every meal I ate, every word I spoke, every expression that crossed my face was scrutinized and corrected. My younger brothers played soccer in the courtyard while I sat through etiquette lessons. They laughed at cartoons while I memorized the names and political positions of every important figure in the Islamic world. By the time I turned 6, I had stopped asking questions about anything that mattered. Not because I wasn't curious, but because curiosity was dangerous. The one time I asked why Allah seemed so angry in the Quran, my tutor's face went white with horror. He called my father immediately, and I spent the rest of that day locked in my room, listening to urgent whispered conversations through the walls. That night, my father sat on the edge of my bed and explained in his gentlest voice that doubt was like a disease. It started small, but could destroy everything if left untreated. "Your faith," he said, stroking my hair, "is not just about you. It's about our family, our nation, our people. When you question Islam, you question all of us." I nodded and promised to be more careful, but something inside me had already begun to crack. They called me the perfect Muslim son, and for 20 years I played the role flawlessly. I stood in ornate mosques during Friday prayers, my white thobe pressed to perfection, my head bowed at precisely the right angle. Foreign journalists would photograph me, reading from the Quran at state ceremonies, and I learned to project an aura of serene faith that made diplomats nod approvingly. I gave speeches about the beauty of Islamic values, about the importance of tradition, about the divine wisdom of Sharia law. Every word was scripted, rehearsed, and delivered with the kind of conviction that comes from years of practice. But inside, I was drowning. The more perfectly I performed faith, the more hollow I felt. My prayers became elaborate theatrical productions, where I was both actor and audience, going through motions that had long since lost any meaning. When I prostrated myself toward Mecca 5 times a day, pressing my forehead against the cool marble, I felt nothing but emptiness echoing in the chambers of my chest. The Imam would speak of Allah's infinite mercy, but all I could hear were the conditions, the requirements, the long list of ways I could fail and face eternal punishment. I began to develop what I now recognize as spiritual anxiety, a constant gnawing fear that I wasn't Muslim enough, faithful enough, worthy enough. I would lie awake at night, my heart racing as I replayed every prayer, every verse, every ritual, searching for mistakes that might have invalidated my worship. The God I was taught to love felt more like a cosmic auditor, scrutinizing every thought and finding me perpetually lacking. Islam spoke of peace, but I had never known a moment's peace. It promised submission, but I felt like I was suffocating. During private study sessions with our family imam, I began asking the questions that had been building pressure in my mind like steam in a kettle. Why did Islamic law value a woman's testimony as worth half a man's? Why was the penalty for leaving the faith so severe if faith was supposed to be a choice? Why did Allah's mercy always seem to come with fine print? Each question was met with increasingly sharp warnings. The Imam's eyes would narrow, and he would remind me that my job was not to understand God, but to obey Him. The human mind, he would say, tapping his temple, is too small to comprehend divine wisdom. Faith means accepting what you cannot understand. But doubt, once awakened, is nearly impossible to silence. It grows in the dark corners of the mind, feeding on unanswered questions and half-formed thoughts. I started paying attention to things I had previously ignored. The fear in people's eyes when they spoke about religious matters, the way conversations died when certain topics were raised, the careful distance everyone maintained from anything that might be interpreted as criticism of the faith. I realized I was living in a world where intellectual honesty was not just discouraged, but dangerous, where the very act of thinking too deeply was seen as a form of rebellion. One evening, as I walked through the servants' quarters looking for a book I had left in the kitchen, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. Music was drifting from one of the staff rooms, not the formal, structured rhythms of Islamic chanting, but something soft and organic, like a gentle river flowing over stones. I followed the sound to the kitchen where Luz, our Filipino housemaid, stood washing dishes while humming to herself. She was a small woman with kind eyes who had worked for our family for nearly a decade, invisible in the way that servants often are to the wealthy. But as I stood in the doorway, she became the most visible person in my world. Her voice was untrained but pure, carrying a melody that seemed to wrap around my heart like warm hands. Then she began to sing words in English. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." I didn't understand every word, but I understood the feeling. This wasn't worship born from fear or obligation, but from love. Pure, uncomplicated, joyful love. When she noticed me standing there, she stopped abruptly and bowed her head. "I'm so sorry, young master. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." Her face flushed with embarrassment, and I realized she was afraid she'd be punished for singing Christian songs in a Muslim household. But I shook my head quickly. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Don't stop. It's beautiful." She looked up at me with surprise, then smiled and continued. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The words hit me like a physical force. Lost, found, blind, see. These weren't just lyrics. They were a perfect description of everything I felt but couldn't name. That night, after the palace had settled into its usual silence, I crept to my laptop and began searching. I typed "Amazing Grace" into the search bar, then spent hours following links deeper and deeper into a world I had never known existed. I found Christian hymns, testimonies, videos of people speaking about Jesus not as a distant prophet, but as a friend, a brother, someone who understood their pain and loved them anyway. I watched with the sound turned down low, reading subtitles and feeling something inside me crack open. These people talked about God the way Luz sang, with joy instead of fear, with love instead of obligation. They spoke of grace like it was water in the desert, freely given and endlessly available. I had spent my entire life trying to earn God's approval through perfect behavior, but these strangers on my computer screen talked about a God who loved them not because of what they did, but because of who they were. It was the most foreign concept I had ever encountered, and the most beautiful. For weeks, I returned to those videos, like a man dying of thirst returns to a well. I learned about Jesus, not Isa, the prophet of Islam, but Jesus, the Son of God, the one who claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. I read the Sermon on the Mount and wept at its gentleness. I watched testimonies of former Muslims who had found peace in Christianity, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone in my questions. These people understood the weight of religious expectation, the suffocating nature of faith based on fear, the desperate hunger for a God who might actually want to know them personally. The dreams began 3 weeks after I first heard Luz singing. I would find myself in landscapes that felt more real than reality itself. Vast deserts where the sand sparkled like diamonds, gardens where every flower had a unique fragrance, seashores where waves sang lullabies in languages I had never learned, but somehow understood. And always, walking toward me through these impossible places, was a figure in white robes. His face was kind, but somehow familiar, like seeing a childhood friend after many years apart. He never spoke with words, but communication flowed between us like light. When he looked at me, every fear I had ever carried simply evaporated. The anxiety about not being good enough, the terror of divine punishment, the crushing weight of trying to earn love through perfect behavior, all of it disappeared in the warmth of his gaze. Sometimes he would reach out and touch my shoulder, and in that moment I would feel more loved, more known, more accepted than I had ever felt in my waking life. The peace was so complete, so overwhelming, that I would wake up with tears streaming down my face. Not from sadness, but from the most beautiful homesickness I had ever experienced. I began to pray differently. Instead of reciting memorized verses in Arabic, I started having conversations. "Are you the one in my dreams?" I would whisper into the darkness of my room. "Are you calling me?" I used the name Isa because it was familiar, but I wasn't praying to the Prophet of Islam anymore. I was praying to someone who felt less like a distant judge and more like a loving father. The silence that followed my whispered questions wasn't empty. It was full of presence, like being held by invisible arms. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of God. I was afraid of losing Him. My transformation didn't go unnoticed. I became distracted during formal prayers, sometimes catching myself humming Christian melodies under my breath. I started asking different kinds of questions during religious instruction, not challenging the imam directly, but probing around the edges of doctrine in ways that made him uncomfortable. My demeanor changed too. The rigid perfection I had maintained for years began to soften, replaced by something my family couldn't identify but instinctively distrusted. It all came crashing down on a Tuesday morning in March. I had stepped onto my bedroom balcony to listen to the dawn call to prayer echoing across the city from dozens of minarets. The muezzin's voice was hauntingly beautiful, as it had always been. But instead of preparing for morning prayers, I found myself thinking about the Christian songs I had been listening to. Then I heard it, drifting up from the servants' courtyard below. Almost masked by the call to prayer was that familiar melody. Several of our staff members had gathered in the small courtyard for what I later learned was their morning devotion. They sang Amazing Grace in soft, hushed tones, thinking the walls and distance would hide their voices. But I heard every word, and without thinking, without calculating the risk, I began to hum along. My voice, trained from childhood for Quranic recitation, found a different rhythm, a different purpose. For those precious minutes, I stood on that balcony and sang about grace I had never known but somehow recognized in the deepest part of my soul. The harmony felt like coming home to a place I had never been. My trained voice, usually employed in formal religious settings, discovered a new kind of worship, one that came from joy instead of duty, from love instead of fear. I was so lost in the music, so caught up in this moment of pure connection, that I didn't notice Hassan, one of our security guards, standing in the garden below, with his face turned upward, recording everything on his phone. 2 hours later, while I was having breakfast with my brothers, my laptop disappeared from my room. My phone was confiscated without explanation, and my father's voice, tight with controlled rage, echoed through the palace halls. "Bring him to my study immediately." I knew, even before I walked through those mahogany doors, that my carefully constructed life was about to collapse. The only surprise was how ready I felt for it to happen. The family council was already assembled when I entered my father's study, a room I had always associated with important decisions and serious conversations. My father sat behind his massive desk, flanked by 3 of my uncles and Imam Rashid, whose presence at family meetings was never a good sign. The atmosphere was heavy with the kind of tension that precedes life-changing moments. On the desk between us lay printed screenshots of every Christian website I had visited, transcripts of the songs I had hummed that morning, and a detailed report from Hassan documenting weeks of what he called suspicious behavior. My father spoke. First, his voice carefully modulated, but trembling with suppressed emotion. "We have evidence," he said, gesturing toward the papers, "that you have been consuming Christian propaganda and engaging in behavior that brings shame to our family and our faith. Before we proceed, I want to give you an opportunity to explain yourself. Tell us this was curiosity. Tell us you were researching our enemies to better understand them. Tell us anything that makes sense." His eyes, which had looked at me with pride for 26 years, now held a mixture of disappointment and desperate hope. I could have lied. The words were right there, ready to tumble from my lips. Explanations, justifications, promises to be more careful. I could have claimed temporary madness, academic research, or the influence of bad companions. My family wanted to believe a lie that would preserve their world, and I had the power to give them that gift. But standing there, facing the men who had shaped my entire existence, I felt that same supernatural peace from my dreams washing over me like warm water. "I believe in Isa," I said quietly, using the Arabic name they would recognize. "I believe Jesus is the Son of God." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that could never be extinguished. My father's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of grief I had never seen before. The Imam stood so violently that his chair fell backward, clattering against the marble floor. "You will take those words back," my father said, his voice now barely controlled. "You will kneel on this floor and swear by Allah that this was the devil whispering in your ear, that you were temporarily insane, that you reject these blasphemous ideas completely." He stood and moved around the desk, his hands shaking as he reached for me. "You are my son. You are the future of our family. I will not let you destroy yourself with this madness." I looked at each of them in turn, these men who had loved me, guided me, and prepared me for greatness as they understood it. I saw the genuine anguish in their faces, the way my father's eyes glistened with unshed tears, the way my uncles shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as if witnessing a traffic accident. These weren't evil men. They were men trapped in a system that couldn't accommodate the kind of truth I had discovered. But I couldn't go back to sleep once I had awakened. "I can't take it back," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, because it's the truest thing I've ever said in my life. The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted, shouting, accusations, demands, threats. But through it all, I felt held by an invisible presence, surrounded by a peace that transcended understanding. I had finally spoken my truth, and no earthly consequence could make me regret it. What followed was swift and brutal in its efficiency. In Islamic law and family tradition, I had committed apostasy, a crime worse than murder because it threatened the spiritual fabric of the community. They couldn't simply ignore my declaration or hope it would pass. Action had to be taken, both to punish me and to demonstrate to others that such rebellion would not be tolerated. Within hours, I was stripped of my title, my inheritance, and my name. Legal documents were drawn up declaring me dead to the family. My face was cut out of photographs, my achievements erased from family records, my very existence edited out of our history. They locked me in a windowless storage room in the basement of the palace, a space normally used for keeping extra furniture and seasonal decorations. The irony wasn't lost on me. The prince, who had once lived in luxury, was now surrounded by covered chairs and rolled carpets, sustained by nothing but stale bread and water brought twice a day by servants who wouldn't meet my eyes. The room was cold and damp, and after years of silk sheets and climate-controlled comfort, the concrete floor felt like sleeping on ice. My brothers took turns visiting me, and these were perhaps the most heartbreaking moments of my imprisonment. These young men who had wrestled with me as children, who had shared secrets and dreams, now stood before me with tears streaming down their faces as they begged me to recant. When I refused, they would strike me with their fists, not out of hatred, but out of a desperate love that didn't know how else to express itself. "Just say you were wrong." My youngest brother sobbed after hitting me so hard my lip split. "Just say it and come home." But I couldn't. Every blow they landed made me more certain that I belonged to someone else now, someone who had already taken the worst beating of all on my behalf. On the third night of my imprisonment, my father came to me alone. Gone was the rage and disappointment of our confrontation. In its place was a terrible weariness, the look of a man watching his world crumble. He sat on an overturned crate across from where I lay on the floor, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other, father and son, separated by more than religious differences now, divided by two completely different understandings of reality. "You have until dawn," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Renounce this Christian nonsense publicly, swear your loyalty to Islam and to this family, and we can begin to rebuild. Refuse, and I will have you committed to the psychiatric hospital in Damascus. The doctors there specialize in treating religious delusions. No one will ever find you there, and eventually you will forget these dangerous ideas." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "I love you, my son, but I love our faith and our family more. Choose wisely." After he left, I lay in the darkness contemplating my options. I could surrender my newfound faith and return to the comfortable prison of my former life, or I could trust the voice that had called me by name, even if it meant losing everything I had ever known. The choice should have been agonizing, but I found myself filled with a strange sense of anticipation, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to discover I could fly. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Jesus, if you're real, if you really want me, then show me the way out. I'm ready to follow you anywhere." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, full of a presence that made the cold room feel warm. Then, at exactly 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the corridor above, and the distant sounds of kitchen staff beginning their early morning preparations. The voice came not as sound, but as knowing, like information being downloaded directly into my consciousness. "I call you by name. Come out." I stood and walked to the door that should have been locked, had been locked every time I had tested it over the past 3 days. But now it opened with the gentlest pressure, swinging soundlessly on well-oiled hinges. The basement corridor, usually patrolled by guards, was empty. The staircase leading to the main floor, normally monitored by security cameras, felt invisible to any watching eyes. I walked through the palace where I had spent my entire life, past portraits of ancestors who would disown me, toward the servants' entrance where I had never been allowed to go. A bakery truck was idling in the service courtyard, its engine running quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. The driver, a thin man with weathered hands and kind eyes, was loading fresh bread for the palace's morning meal. When he saw me approaching in my prison clothes, wrinkled shirt and dirty pants, his eyes widened with recognition. "You're the minister's son," he whispered, glancing around nervously. I nodded, unable to find words. "And you need to leave this place," he said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. Without another word, he gestured for me to climb into the passenger seat. As we drove through the palace gates for what I knew would be the last time, he introduced himself. "My name is Yusuf. I clean floors at the Christian church in the old city. When I prayed this morning, as I do every morning, God told me to drive slowly past your palace. Now I understand why." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if divine interventions were a normal part of his Tuesday morning routine. We drove in comfortable silence through the awakening city, past the mosque where I had given my last speech about Islamic values, past the government buildings where my father wielded political power, past the life I was leaving behind forever. At the border crossing to Saudi Arabia, Yusuf handed me off to another believer, a woman named Miriam, who smuggled Christian literature in shipments of medical supplies. She passed me to a truck driver named Paul, who carried me to Jordan hidden among boxes of humanitarian aid. Each person in this invisible network knew exactly what to do, as if my escape had been orchestrated by a higher power that specialized in impossible rescues. No one asked for payment or explanation. They simply saw a brother in need and offered what they had: transportation, shelter, food, prayers whispered in languages I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it meant to be part of a family that wasn't bound by blood or nationality, but by something deeper and more lasting. In Amman, Jordan, I held my first physical Bible, not pixels on a laptop screen, but actual paper pages I could touch and smell and carry with me. The Christian family hosting me presented it like a treasure, wrapped in cloth and inscribed with my new name: Luke Elias Collad, beloved son. I opened to the Gospel of John and read Jesus' words. "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never cast out." Never cast out. The boy whose name had been erased from palace records, whose existence had been edited out of family history, was promised he would never be rejected by the one who mattered most. I wept until I thought I had no tears left, then wept some more. These weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief, like finally breathing after holding your breath for 26 years. I read the Bible voraciously, sometimes staying up all night to absorb stories of other people who had left everything to follow Jesus. Abraham leaving his father's house, the disciples abandoning their fishing nets, Paul surrendering his prestigious position as a Pharisee. I wasn't alone in my choice. I was part of an ancient tradition of people who had discovered that some treasures are worth any sacrifice. A month later, I stood waist-deep in the Jordan River as Pastor Michael prepared to baptize me. The water was cold, fed by mountain streams that had flowed through this landscape since biblical times. Other believers stood on the banks singing hymns in Arabic, English, and languages I couldn't identify. As I went under the water, I felt the last traces of my old identity wash away. When I came up gasping and sputtering, the first words I spoke were my chosen name, Luke Elias Khalad. Not prince, not heir, not the perfect Muslim son. Just Luke, beloved of God, child of the Most High, brother to all who shared this same impossible grace. The pastor embraced me, and the congregation erupted in celebration. Standing there, dripping wet, looking at faces of strangers who had become family, I realized I wasn't running from something anymore. I was running towards someone who had been calling my name since before I was born. The palace I had lost was built on fear, tradition, and the approval of men who could never be satisfied. But the kingdom I had found was built on love, sacrifice, and the approval of the one who had created me for exactly this moment. I was no longer a prisoner of perfection, no longer suffocating under the weight of impossible expectations. I was free to be broken, free to ask questions, free to love and be loved without conditions or requirements. A Christian refugee organization helped me reach Cyprus, where I applied for asylum as a religious refugee. The process was more complicated than I had imagined. Former members of government families don't simply vanish without diplomatic consequences, and my father's influence reached into many international circles. Intelligence agencies from 3 countries had flagged my name, wanting to understand how the son of Bahrain's interior minister had ended up seeking sanctuary in a Mediterranean church. My case file grew thick with stamps and signatures, each one representing another bureaucrat trying to decide if I was a genuine refugee or a potential security risk. The asylum interviews were grueling exercises in reliving trauma while maintaining composure. Social workers with kind eyes but procedural minds asked me to explain again and again why I couldn't simply return home and apologize to my family. How do you make someone understand that going back would mean erasing your soul? How do you explain that some doors, once walked through, can never be reopened? I showed them the scars on my ribs where my brothers had beaten me, the psychological evaluations that documented my religious delusion, the death threats that followed me across 3 countries. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and hearts change even slower. After 6 months of temporary permits and pending reviews, the final letter arrived. Crisp government letterhead bearing words that should have devastated me. Application denied. The reasons were complex and political. My high-profile family, background, concerns about diplomatic relations with Bahrain, questions about my motives for conversion. But as I sat in the small church office reading those words, I felt only peace. Rejection from earthly governments meant nothing when I had been accepted by the government of heaven. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket, where I carry it still, not as a badge of failure, but as a reminder that my citizenship lies elsewhere. Father Andreas, the elderly priest who had become my unofficial guardian, found me that evening sitting in the church sanctuary, staring at the simple wooden cross that had become my anchor. "You're staying anyway," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "Then you're not a refugee anymore," he continued, settling into the pew beside me. "Your family stays." That night, he led me to a small room behind the church that had once housed traveling missionaries. It was barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a narrow wardrobe, but it felt more like home than the 47 rooms of my childhood palace. The church community embraced me with a completeness that still takes my breath away. These weren't wealthy people. Cyprus had been struggling economically for years, and many of the congregation worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet. But they shared what they had with the generosity of those who understand that true poverty has nothing to do with money. Mrs. Elena, who cleaned offices at night, brought me homemade soup every Tuesday. Dmitri, an unemployed carpenter, taught me to repair things with my hands instead of simply replacing them. Young Maria, barely 18 and working in a tourist shop, practiced her English by reading Bible stories aloud while I helped her with pronunciation. They never made me feel like a charity case or a conversion project. They understood intuitively that I hadn't just changed religions. I had changed worlds entirely. They gave me space to grieve what I had lost while celebrating what I had gained. When I would wake up crying from dreams about my brothers, they didn't try to fix me with easy answers. They simply sat with me in the darkness until dawn came. When I struggled with guilt over the pain I had caused my family, they reminded me that love sometimes requires choices that look like betrayal from the outside. The work they found for me was perfect in its simplicity. I became the church's liaison for refugees and asylum seekers, helping translate Arabic documents, navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy that had nearly crushed my own spirit, and providing cultural context that helped social workers understand the unique challenges faced by Middle Eastern Christians. My palace education in languages and international relations finally found a purpose that fed my soul instead of draining it. Every week brought new faces, Syrians fleeing civil war, Iraqis escaping religious persecution, Afghans who had helped Western forces and now faced retaliation. Each story was different, but the eyes were always the same. Haunted by loss, afraid to hope, desperately trying to rebuild identity from the fragments of shattered lives. I saw myself in every trembling hand that signed asylum applications, in every whispered prayer for family members left behind, in every sleepless night spent wondering if safety was real or just another illusion. Working with these broken people began to heal something in me I hadn't even realized was damaged. For 26 years, I had lived for applause, the approval of family, the admiration of dignitaries, the fear disguised as respect of subjects. But here, translating for a grandmother who had walked across 3 countries carrying only her grandson's photograph, or helping a former imam fill out forms that would let him work as a janitor, I discovered the quiet satisfaction of service that expected nothing in return. The most meaningful part of my work happened in the evenings, after official hours ended and the building grew quiet. Using encrypted messaging apps and carefully worded posts on underground forums, I began reaching out to Muslims across the Middle East who were wrestling with the same questions that had once consumed my nights. I didn't proselytize or attack their faith. I simply offered them what I had desperately needed during my own journey, the knowledge that they weren't alone in their doubts. My messages were like bottles thrown into a digital ocean, never knowing where they might wash ashore or whose hands might find them. But slowly, responses began to arrive. A university student in Tehran questioning why women needed male permission for basic freedoms. A businessman in Riyadh struggling with the cognitive dissonance between Islamic teachings and his own sense of justice. A teenage girl in Cairo, afraid to admit that she no longer felt Allah's presence during prayers. Each conversation required extreme caution. Government surveillance in these countries was sophisticated and brutal, and the penalty for apostasy was often death. I learned to speak in metaphors and analogies, to discuss philosophical concepts rather than personal beliefs, to plant seeds of doubt so gently that they felt like the questioner's own thoughts. It was spiritual guerrilla warfare, fought with love instead of bullets, won through patience rather than force. The breakthrough came when one of my online contacts, a young man from Saudi Arabia who had been questioning Islam for months, finally made the decision to follow Christ. He couldn't be baptized publicly, couldn't attend church, couldn't even own a Bible. But his heart had changed in ways that no government could monitor or control. Through encrypted video calls, I watched him take communion alone in his apartment, using grape juice and bread, while I participated from my small room in Cyprus. We were separated by 1,000 miles and political systems that wanted us dead. But we were more truly united than I had ever been with my biological brothers. This digital ministry grew slowly but steadily. I became part of an invisible network of believers who supported each other across borders that existed only on maps. We shared prayer requests in coded language, celebrated spiritual victories in careful whispers, and mourned losses that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The boy who had been silenced at age 6 had found his voice again, not in palace speeches or political proclamations, but in quiet conversations that changed hearts one whisper at a time. On Sundays, when the church filled with the mixture of languages and cultures that had become my new normal, I would think about the homogeneous congregation of my youth, everyone dressed identically, praying in unison, their faith as uniform as their appearance. Here, diversity was celebrated rather than suppressed. Coptic Christians from Egypt sat next to Orthodox refugees from Syria. Filipino domestic workers worshipped alongside Lebanese merchants. Former Muslims like myself found acceptance among people who had never questioned their faith because they had never needed to. During communion, as we passed the bread and wine among this unlikely family, I would remember my dreams from those final nights in the palace. The figure in white walking toward me across impossible landscapes. Now I understood that he hadn't just been calling me to himself. He had been calling me to this, to a community that transcended nationality, race, and background, united only by the recognition that we were all broken people who had been loved back to wholeness. The most powerful moments came when former Muslims found each other in our congregation. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a recognition of the unique price we had paid for our faith. We didn't need to explain the nightmares about family members we would never see again, or the complex grief of mourning people who were still alive but considered us dead. We simply sat together in the back pews and let our presence comfort each other in ways that words couldn't accomplish. My room behind the church became a sanctuary, not just for me, but for others walking the same difficult path. Late at night, when official help wasn't available, people would knock softly on my door. Sometimes they needed practical assistance, help filling out forms or understanding legal procedures. Sometimes they needed someone who understood the particular loneliness of being rejected by your birth family for choosing your spiritual family. We would drink tea and share stories until dawn, building bridges of understanding across the chasm of cultural loss. The simple rhythms of church life, morning prayers, evening services, weekly communion, seasonal celebrations, provided structure for a life that had lost all its familiar landmarks. Christmas in Cyprus became more meaningful than any religious festival from my youth because it celebrated someone I actually knew rather than merely feared. Easter morning, with its message of resurrection and new life, felt like my own story being told in ancient words that suddenly made sense. Living on the margins of society taught me lessons that palace luxury never could. I learned that dignity doesn't require wealth, that community doesn't need hierarchy, that worship doesn't require performance. The church became my university, teaching me practical skills like budgeting and cooking, but more importantly, showing me how to live with less while somehow having more than I had ever possessed. As my second year in Cyprus began, I realized I was no longer the frightened refugee who had arrived with nothing but trauma and hope. I had become part of something larger than myself, a network of believers who measured success not in political power or material accumulation, but in lives changed, hearts healed, and love multiplied across impossible distances. The prince who had lost his earthly kingdom had found his true calling in expanding a heavenly one careful conversation at a time. The morning light folds itself over the harbor like warm linen, and I walk the shoreline barefoot, letting the tide erase every print the moment it is made. My residency card still reads pending. My bank account trembles near zero, yet my heart is steadier than at any time inside the palace. The sea is an open-handed teacher. It accepts every river, keeps none, and returns in rhythms too ancient for fear. I breathe with it until the last residue of anxiety sinks beneath the waves and does not rise again. A fishing boat grumbles past, crew shouting greetings in languages I barely grasp. I wave back, not needing translation. Goodwill sounds the same in every tongue. Around my neck hangs the small wooden cross Father Andreas carved on a night we both fought sleeplessness. The edges are uneven, the grain imperfect, and that is why I cherish it. I used to possess diamonds cut to mathematical precision, None ever felt this alive against my skin. My days now begin in the church kitchen where Mrs. Elena and I brew coffee strong enough to wake stone. Together we pack lunches for the camp, bread, fruit, a handwritten blessing slipped between layers of wax paper like a secret seasoning. I carry the crate to the battered van and start the engine while the choir loft is still humming with dawn prayers. The road to the tents is pitted and dusty, but each pothole reminds me I am traveling freely, not chauffeured under watchful eyes. Freedom includes discomfort. I accept both with gratitude. At the camp gate, children run alongside the van, palms tapping metal like impatient rain. I step out and instantly vanish beneath a small storm of questions. Will I read their English homework? Do I still remember the card trick with the disappearing queen? Did I bring another story about angels who look like ordinary men? I kneel, and for a few minutes the world shrinks to their height. They do not see a former prince or a failed asylum seeker. They see the tall man who keeps his promises. In the medical tent, I translate for doctor Costas as he checks a newborn's lungs. The mother, a woman from Homs whose husband is still missing, clutches my wrist while the stethoscope searches for rhythm. When the baby's first clear cry fills the canvas room, she collapses against me, laughing and weeping at once. I remember the day my own birth was announced with ceremonial gunfire and reporters. Yet I am certain this single cry in a dusty shelter carries more royalty than my entire introduction to the world. Afternoons belong to the translation desk. Paperwork arrives like the tide, endless, unavoidable, sometimes bringing treasure. Today's treasure is a slim envelope containing approval for a Sudanese widow to join her brother in London. She has waited 11 months for this scrap of mercy. I walk it to her room myself. When she reads the stamp, her face folds into tears, and she whispers a prayer in Arabic so pure, I answer Amen before I realize it. She takes my hands, calls me son, and presses a coin into my palm, worthless in currency, priceless in blessing. I tuck it next to the rejection letter inside my pocket shrine to divine economics. Evening settles over the city with the scent of grilled olives and distant music. Back in my tiny room, I open the encrypted app and sift through new messages. A teenager in Karachi asks if it is possible to believe in Jesus, yet still fear the dark. A scholar in Cairo wonders how to forgive a father who insists obedience is worth more than love. I do not offer doctrine, I offer story. I tell them fear is a room with many doors, and Christ knows the key to each one. I tell them forgiveness is never cheap, but always cheaper than bitterness. Sometimes replies come within minutes, sometimes weeks. Either way, I plant the seed and entrust the soil I cannot see. When the church bells toll 9, we gather for Compline. The sanctuary glows with candlelight. Wax drips like slow comets toward the brass holders. We read, "You are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with God's people." The words land differently when your passport says otherwise. Yet I feel the verse settling into my bones the way a final puzzle piece clicks into place. I am done measuring belonging by documents. After prayers, I linger alone. The big wooden doors are open to the courtyard, and a stray cat slips inside, tail high, utterly convinced it belongs among the saints. I laugh softly, then address the empty pews, knowing this recording will reach ears I may never meet. Maybe one of those ears is yours. Perhaps you are sitting in a bedroom thick with silence, or scrolling through comments hoping for a sign impossible to misunderstand. Let this be that sign. I lost a palace and found a kingdom. I surrendered a father's approval and received a father's embrace. I traded lineage for legacy and learned that inheritance is not marble halls, but hearts set free. Do not imagine I am fearless. Courage, for me, is simply refusing to let fear choose the story. Some nights memories still rattle chains under my bed. Yet each morning grace arrives before coffee, reminding me that yesterday's shadows cannot bar today's light. If the voice that once called me through locked doors, the same voice that called fishermen from their nets and tax collectors from their tables, now whispers your name, answer. Jesus doesn't require you to know the route. He only asks for the next honest step. The map unfolds obediently beneath feet willing to follow where love leads. Outside, the sea keeps breathing. Gather, release, teaching in a language older than Scripture, yet somehow speaking the same. Truths Jesus shared beside another sea, where he called ordinary men to extraordinary purpose. I slip off my shoes, walk to the water's edge, and let the tide cover them. Foam curls around my ankles, erases one more set of footprints, and hands me another beginning. The kind of fresh start that only comes when you've learned to walk on water by keeping your eyes fixed on the one who never sinks.